Okay. Yep.
I wanted to thank, first of all, Thomas for inviting me. I'm delighted to be down here again. I got my graduate degrees in the Southwest, and it's nice to be back. I haven't been back in 25 years. When I moved to the Northern Plains, it was expected that I took more interest in the Northern Plains Indians than those of the Southwest, of course, and that's what I've been doing. In the last couple of years, I have been busy writing this book on the hobbyists. And who are these people? Well, if you define them, they are those people who play Indian every weekend and usually belong to a club. There are 10 to 15,000 in Germany, so it's a real movement and has been for a long time. The reason I got interested in it was I never knew about them when I grew up, and I'm sure Thomas didn't either. There are 5 major clubs in my area. I never knew about it. They don't function on a surface level. They function a little bit in the underground, and we have to think about why that is as we go along. I was made aware of them when I was giving a Karl lecture, actually, at the Neanderthal Museum in Düsseldorf, which is the area I come from, and 2 gentlemen came up to me afterwards and said, "Are you coming to our powwow this weekend?" So that was my first encounter with him. It puzzled me a little. But I found a way into the scene, which was rather interesting and has been a rewarding study, I think. And I hope you find that it is rewarding to hear about them. But now it's supposed to move and it doesn't. Let's see. It doesn't move.
He's coming.
That makes me very nervous. You don't like my picture?
It's the curse of New Mexico.
That's okay. Take one to see. Don't worry about it. Just like
Can you turn off the other microphone? Or this one? Yeah, there's just some feedback.
I've decided long ago I'm a curse for anything electronic. I never been able to do that. Yeah. Great, thank you. So how did Germans develop this interest in Native Americans? And you have talked about this for a couple of weeks now, so I'm just going to briefly go over some of the ideas I have about it. First of all, there are, of course, the travel narratives. During the 19th century, there were Germans everywhere traveling through the United States. It's amazing. I found 200 accounts of Germans so far who were traveling throughout the United States in the late 19th century. The most famous one, at least for the Northern Plains, is Prince Maximilian zu Ried. You see him on the left side of the slide. And he collected extensively and left us a wonderful journal that is valuable beyond belief today. He was accompanied by a Swiss painter called Karl, who left us these wonderful pictures. It's never difficult for me to pick this out, the one that I want to use, because this is my favorite one of his pictures. But Maximilian was always available in Germany. He was always in print. People know him, all the hobbyists I know him, and have looked very carefully at the Bodmer paintings because it tells us a lot about the outfits and accoutrements of Native Americans. Another one who is very famous in Germany, not because of what he left in the way of writing, but because of what he collected, is Prince Paul von Württemberg. He was a different traveler from Maximilian. Unfortunately, we lost all his writings because the Württemberg archive was hit by a firebomb at the end of the war in 1944. And unfortunately, all his papers were in the archive and they were destroyed. There is one, the first book of his first adventures in America is still in print. It was printed by the University of Oklahoma Press, but we don't have any of his later adventures. And he was an incredible traveler. He didn't follow the rules that Clark set out for his guests when he permitted them to travel up the Missouri. He would disappear for years, and then we have these letters going up the Missouri. Has anybody seen the prince? Is he still alive? Because it's kind of difficult to tell the King of Württemberg his brother has been shot or scalped or something like that. So he was an incredible traveler. We have a few of his things still, a few of his diary entries, because you won't believe this, but in 1939, an American geologist came to Württemberg, saw the papers in the archives, went out, bought a camera, and took hundreds of photos of the diary pages. And those are the only ones we still have. So it's an incredible richness of things he collected and brought back to Germany more than anything else that we need to consider there. Fictional accounts of American Indians, of course, based on some of these readings. Karl May, as you know, had a large library, research library, that he used for his time, quite large. He had access to both Maximilian and he had access to Paul. He had access to all the famous writers of his time. Since he wasn't here himself, he needed them for his information. You are familiar with his study, which is what he wrote. I like the lion especially well because it sets the tone. You know? So if you look at the wall, you will see his accoutrements that sort of fascinated him and helped him write. Karl May, of course, you have this picture I saw in the gallery. Karl May dressed up as Old Shatterhand. And then the top one is probably the most important one. This is Winnetou, and this is the icon that has dominated the German thought of what American Indians are. And even though, of course, he is an Apache in the books, he's actually dressed like a plains warrior. He's on a horse. He doesn't wear a feather headdress, but he could if he wanted to, and we are told this every single time in every single novel. This is a typical plains image. And for Germans, the plains image is the one that stayed with them. Then, of course, we have other reasons why Germans became so super interested in American Indians. And those are Hagenbeck's Völkerschau, which are the exhibition of peoples. In a fairly recent book, we learned that the Germans were so interested in other people that between 1870 and 1940, 600 different groups came to Germany. And those are not just Native American groups, these are groups from all around the world. And what attracted the Germans to them, there's a recent book called Gezähmte Wilde, Tame Savages. And the woman who wrote the book, Dresbach, puts forward the theory that this is not really about colonialism, and that surprised her when she examined this. This is not about we are better than others. This is about making a connection to the other, seeing the other as part of a family. Usually you have these tableaus, right? People doing things that we are familiar with. feeding children, making pottery, doing household chores. Those sorts of things is what the tableaus presented, and this is what was attractive to the Germans. However, these Völkerschauen had to play into the German stereotypes, especially in regard to Native Americans, more than for any other group. They had to present the plains. This one, for example, Hagenbeck brought some Bella Kula to Germany, which is a northwest coast tribe, very interesting. But they were not appreciated in Germany, and they weren't very successful. And when you look at the picture and you think back to the Winnetou picture, you see why, right? They may have spectacular masks, but they don't present what the Germans had recognized by now as the Indian, right? So these people, they had, from all accounts, they had a wonderful time in Germany, and from all accounts, they are descendants, because they had some German girlfriends, but the Germans as a whole did not appreciate the Bella Kula, okay, because they didn't conform to that sort of idea. The next one, of course, were the Wild West shows, 1890, you're familiar with that, Buffalo Bill Cody. And there, of course, we have that stereotypical image, and that was very much what Cody played for and to, and that was very successful, of course. This is Sarazani, who brought American Indians to Germany from the very beginning. In fact, 10 years earlier, he had already brought Obalala to Germany and exhibited them. And they brought in 1 million visitors during their stay, just in Germany. Can you imagine this? 1 million visitors. Because they, of course, conform to what Germans perceive as Indian, right? So this is basically what Germans expect. Okay? The Plains Indian warrior, the person on horse with a beautifully beaded outfits and feathers in their hair. And I say this, and it sounds very unsophisticated, but it got no more sophisticated as I went along. But this is how we started out. Right? Okay, so what about the hobbyists? Well, this particular one is a hobbyist club. When you look at it, you think Karl, and that's true. This is one of those hybrid clubs that the other hobbyists sort of go like, yeah, you know, those Düsseldorfer people. They are really Karl. You know, this is not good. This is not good, believe me. So this is actually the one that I encountered the first, when I first encountered these Indian hobbyist clubs. This is one that I encountered, and they had invited me to a wedding, but the medicine man never turned up because they had told him that I was there, and I was not, and I never made any bones about what I do, so he didn't turn up. But it was an interesting experience, and I'll talk more about it later on. Germany has a long tradition of clubs. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but the oldest clubs are 600 years old. So we are very clubby people. More than half of the German people actually belong to a club, at least to one. You know, I've never understood why, but that's the way we are. Okay, we are very clubby. We like to share our enthusiasms with others. And there's a saying that you hear a lot, like, any three Germans standing together at the street corner talking are about to found a new club. So the Indian hobbyists, which started out in 1895 with the Wild West Velo Club, on top there, actually are a newcomer in the German club scene. But they're older than you have perhaps thinking. Right? This is a tradition that looks back on 100 and plus years. So it's not a new thing. It's a very established movement that is coming, I think, that's coming towards an end rather than a beginning. But I will talk about that a little bit later. What these Wild West Velo Club members did, they founded a club to introduce immigrants, prospective immigrants, to America. And the best way to do that is to dress up as cowboy and Indians and ride your bicycle along the rim of a buried gold. So that would prepare them for what they were going to encounter in the New World. And that's how this all started out. These clubs were supposed to introduce Germans to the rigors of America and the people they were going to encounter there. After World War II, there's a very interesting development. Because as you all know, we all of a sudden have a divided Germany. The oldest club that is still in existence today is the one in Munich. But there's also one, 10 years later, that is in Dresden, the old Manitou Club. And when Germany is divided, we have the tradition on both sides of the wall. Okay? But because of the political systems, they develop a little bit differently. And let me quickly tell you how that works. In West Germany, and I say West Germany, I hope nobody's offended by that, but when I say BRD, then you have to think about it for a second, you know. And so the former West Germany saw the golden age of Indian hobbyists between 1960 and 1990, really. They were organized. Germans are organized, if nothing else. They were organized on a local level in their clubs. They were organized in regional levels by organizations, and they had a national organization that has been in existence for over 60 years. It's called der Westernbund. And they have a national encampment every year. And we will see some pictures of that in a little while. Ernst Dietzuleit from one of the Indian clubs talked once about the friendship among sort of laid out the sort of goals of the Indian hobbyist movement in 1951 at the First Council. And he talked about the friendship among all peoples of learning to understand those lost Indians. And he promised to challenge all those who were put on cowboy celebrations for show. The German Dakota want more. They want to acquire insight into the culture and customs of their role models. They want, as the great men of the Pale Faces say, to conduct a systematic ethnographic study. And they are steadfast idealists in their goals. You can't get much more German than that. What happens is that they choose, of course, mostly plains tribes, because that's what they're familiar with. And at first, their sort of recreations of clothes that these people wore were not very good. However, as time went on, one of the great emphasis from the 1960s on in the German Indian hobby scene becomes authenticity. And I hate to say this, but we don't suffer those who don't live up to our expectations very gladly. And so they're not always very forgiving to those who don't live up to their standards. And I have seen people walk up to other people and say, your shirt was worn in the 1860s, however the beads are 1845. And that's totally impossible. Yeah. So there's a conflict there over those sorts of issues. It strikes us as kind of funny, and it is, but not really, because they also do this when real American Indians are present. And I have seen somebody say to a Native American I happen to know, you don't dance right, you have to leave the arena. Which is very embarrassing, and I sort of always pretend I don't belong, which I don't, so that's fine. Okay, East Germany. What is happening in East Germany? Well, you remember we have a communist government, socialist government, that looks with deep suspicion of anything that's American. So how are they going to continue their hobby, and how are they going to grow, which they did? Well, of course, Native Americans are being exploited by the capitalist government of America. And so they exploited people, we have to show solidarity. And that was how they ultimately convinced the government to let them proceed. It was a long time before they actually did this, before the government actually said, okay, you do contribute to our culture, cultural events, and we like for you to continue doing this. However, they drew a line at cowboys, no cowboys. And when they make the argument that, well, they are exploited by the robber barons and by the cattle barons, that argument didn't fly. So officially, we have West Germany with Indians and cowboys and Union and Confederate troops and fur traders and mountain men and you name it. And then we have East Germany with Indians. However, they also became cowboys at night. I mean, who was going to say anything about it, right? So the argument is actually, if you ask them today, well, you wouldn't want to expose the beadwork to an evening in the saloon. And we also didn't want to dishonor Native Americans by spending the evening in the saloon in our outfits. So everybody having a Stetson smuggled in became a status symbol. And there are some who say that those who had the Stetson actually committed an act of resistance. I'm not sure whether that is true or not. However, the East Germans really labored under some disadvantages because the East Germans had no access to materials beyond what was known country. So many of the, like, take Leipzig for example. Leipzig was, the museum was, as its big ethnographic museum, was hit by a firebomb too. And the only things that remained were the Botman paintings and some of the Plains artifacts. And so they became Plains people, in this case, Mandan. And the Mandan, the Mandan Indians, had their following goals. The most important concern of the group is the tending of Indian customs and cultural heritage. One studies the lifeways and ways of thinking, the mores and customs of the Mandan people, and attempts to duplicate them. Because the literature related to these themes is studied so intensely, the group members do succeed in gaining insight into the religious, mystic, and ceremonial experiences of the Indians. One makes oneself familiar with the Indian language. It is needed in particular for dances, songs, and ceremonies. The goal of the group is to make its knowledge about lifeways of the Mandan, which are acquired with much patience and perseverance, accessible to and understandable for the masses. This still happens through a broad offering of events such as group performances, slideshows, and exhibits. So in order to keep their credit good, the East Germans had to talk about contemporary American Indians. They had to show that indeed they were the suppressed people, right? So ironically, you have the East Germans much more concerned with contemporary Native Americans on the surface, because really what they're interested in is the 19th century. But on the surface they're contemporary, while the West Germans never even made that connection in most cases. They're only interested in traditional American Indian cultures, whatever that may mean. Usually it means reservation time, and usually it means pre-1890, which is the massacre at Wounded Knee, and with that, of course, an end, as far as the hobbyists are concerned, to traditional Indian culture. The East Germans too are concerned about authenticity, and they have one advantage over the West Germans, and they always point this out. They have access to the original beads because they came from Czechoslovakia, a friendly state, right? So they have access to the right kind of beads, while the West Germans had a little bit of a problem with that at first. But they're just as concerned about authenticity. They're just as concerned about, oh my gosh, this is 1830, what is the right bead color? What is the right leather? What is the right cut of the shirt? As the West German counterparts. They just have to improvise a lot more. In the West German scene, my favorite story is the story, I'll tell it later. It's easier later. Okay. So today we have numerous clubs 10 to 15,000 Germans belonged to the Western Bund. And there were about 1,000 Germans, East Germans, at reunification in 1989. So they had about 30 clubs. And what happened after reunification? Well, the East Germans were always regarded condescendingly by the West Germans, which doesn't surprise anybody, and treated as the poor cousins. The East Germans, of course, resent that. And so far, there has been very little meeting of the mind. The East Germans say West Germans are commercial, and West Germans never have to struggle for anything, they don't know anything. The West Germans, on the other hand, say about the East Germans, oh, they're all Kamai. That's not a good thing. So they haven't come together. They still have their separate encampments, their national encampments, the Council for West Germany and the Week for East Germany. In the Week, we only have Indians. In the Council, we have everybody. And as you know, Germans are nothing if organized, so here we have the Western Bund. This is the council I actually went to. They let me come on an off day when there was nothing going on, of course, and let me through the camp until they realized I knew the president, and then they just set me free. But look at the encampment. I've never seen so many teepees actually in one place, including Crow Fair. The camp is incredible. You have all kinds of things set up. You have drying racks. You have tripods with people's treasured possessions on them. You have it's an incredible view. When I was there, and this is part of the reason why they are so in the underground, while I was there walking around with the head chief, who was wearing a loincloth and moccasins and a leather wrap, I suppose it was a robe, he thought it was a robe, we met a camera crew in the charge of another chief. And the woman who was running the camera crew was really pushy. And you know that is not out of character either. There was somebody, we heard drumming from somewhere to the side, and they wanted to know what was going on. And the head chief kept saying, it's none of your business. And she insisted, I have a right to know. And he said, no, you don't. You don't have a right to know. And while they were arguing, I was sort of fascinated to see the Kit Fox Society, which is a warrior society among the plains, walk past me in full regalia with a woman in the middle who had nothing to do there. Okay? So I was very surprised, and I was looking at that. I didn't say a word. I thought that the quieter you are, the better it is. And the TV camera finally got turfed out. Germans are still very uneasy about this whole phenomenon, and they treat it sort of like they're in their second youth. You know, let's not take them too serious. They're just weird people. You know? And the hobbyists are very much afraid of that, and they don't like to interact with people like that. And if you're quiet and you are there to learn, then they're perfectly willing to take you around and talk to you about things. On the right, you see the main street, because as I said, the council does more than just simply Indians. It also has Confederate and Union troops, and it has mountain men, cowboys. Oh, it now has a train. You know, the train followers, the women of repute, have that too now. I don't know. I didn't ask. I was afraid to ask whether the ill repute still applies, but that was what happened. These are older pictures of events at the council, and you see men in feather headdresses, the teepees in the background, and they always have horses there too. So it's quite an event. They usually have about 3,000 participants, so that's quite an event. Now this was my very first event. I mean, this is in the middle of Hamburg, Germany. And I walk into the park and I look down and there are these teepees. This is really strange. So I went down and examined this. And there you see two ladies standing there. She is the wife of a mountain man. She's an Indian, but she's the wife of a mountain man, and that's their daughter. How much this becomes a reality to people is sometimes a little frightening. When I was at the Düsseldorf Club, there was a young man there that I later met for more in-depth conversation. And he told me all about having captured his wife. He's German, by the way. He was his wife. He's Dakota, and his wife was Blackfoot. And so he captured her from the Blackfoot and brought her back, and they melded their styles, and she accepted his Dakota, but she still decorates their beadwork differently. This is how much they sort of conceptualize this into their daily lives in many ways. Another event was somebody telling me it was at the same encampment. I mean, it's a sense of unreality when I go to these encampments. The Düsseldorf Club has it's in a suburban area. Across is a huge tennis hall with lots of courts. Next to it it's a big suburban sprawl. There are two empty lots, and that's where they have their club meetings. That's where they set up their teepees. The neighbors complain because they light a fire for which they have to get an ordinance. And because it smokes up their windows. You know, Germans, and they have clean windows. And that's the worst part about it. And they drum, and that's not acceptable. But I walk around the teepee, one of the teepees, and all of a sudden here's a Tuareg from Northern Africa. And I go like, what? And well, it was kind of unexpected, to be honest. And later on I asked the same guy that I was interviewing, he said, well, you know, that's my friend from a different hobby group. I thought, okay. Well, I followed up on that, and there's a book called Die Kölner Stämme. And it's a picture book, and I'll show you some pictures out of it a little later. And it turns out that in and around Cologne are 60 different clubs imitating different ethnicities, including Africans. So this Tuareg friend of his belongs to one of those clubs, and he was visiting. And I was like, and why was he visiting? Well, he was visiting because, you know, when the US Army brought the camels to the Southwest, and they did, it's a historic fact, they had to bring in some people who knew about camels. And so they brought him. Okay. I never really could figure this quite out because I didn't point this out to him either, because I'm the interviewer, I'm not supposed to pose these very rattling questions. But he's Dakota, he's from the plains. And they were in the Southwest. How did that work, you know? It took me 2 days to drive down here. How the heck did that work? They sometimes don't have answers to that, but it's pretty interesting. Anyway, as an academic, I like charts, obviously. And I sort of identified 3 different kinds of hobbyists. There are the searchers, the builders, and the all-around hobbyists. And when you look at the searchers, this is the only hobbyist I've met, well, 2 hobbyists. One of the 2 hobbyists I never gave my business card to. He's one of those people who considers himself Indian. And he is not part of a club because he does things by instinct, so his authenticity is off. And under his construction there is a commercial dome tent. So people don't take to him and are very uneasy around him. He's very esoteric in many ways. And you know this New Age, you know this in this area too. He went to Thailand one summer as an Indian. You know? So for most of the year he lives like an Indian, what he thinks Indians lived like in the 1850s, except in the winter, of course. So he's one of those who sort of try to become Indian. And I'm happy to say that they are not the majority of the hobbyists. They are a small minority. I don't know how small a minority, but the hobbyists are very uneasy, that I know are very uneasy around people like that. Now the builders are very interesting, because the builders, and that's what they like to call it, they build clothing, they build things. The builders are only really interested in making things. This is a man I met, very interesting man by the way, a man that I met at a powwow. And you often see Indian hobbyists at powwow, which are modern occurrences, but they stand around and look and show people how Indians really are, instead of these modern sort of powwow outfits. The outfits are incredibly beautiful. These shirts, you could not tell whether or not these were made in the 19th century or the 20th. The beads are meticulous. The only way you can tell is because there's not a single flaw in them. This is not how Native Americans functioned. I mean, they did this at firelight, right? Many times. They beaded at firelight. You often picked the wrong bead, and that was okay. Not he. When he does something wrong, he opens everything up until he gets to the mistake and fixes it. Okay? He's an obsessive builder, and he's indeed a builder. And that's all he is. He's not really interested in the culture of the people. He's not really, and that's not true for all builders, but for many. He's not interested in the culture of the people, he's interested in their objects. It was kind of interesting to hear him talk about all his experiments to dye the leather and what he actually mixed together to get those shades, because of course commercial colors would never do. There are two schools of thought about this among the hobbyists. The ones say we have to reproduce a specific object exactly. The others say we have to abstract the meaning of this and then reinterpret it, because otherwise it's simply imitating something that already exists and that they don't want to do. Both groups are acceptable as long as they find that as long as they find acceptance among their objects, find acceptance among their friends. The one with the Tuareg friend told me the story about his beadwork, which was not acceptable to his friends because it was too realistic. He had two snakes, and that was too realistic, so he had to come up with a different beadwork design. And that's what he did. But it's a lot easier for West Germans, and has always been a lot easier, because they had access to catalogs that very early on gave them access to American materials, the Hudson Bay catalog and some others. So they very early on had access, while the East Germans did not. I still remember Max Olive, who was one of the grand old men of the Indian hobbyists, telling me how he was experimenting with quilling. And you need the quills of the porcupine for it, and the porcupine is not native to Germany. So he wrote a friend in Minnesota that he had, and he shot a porcupine, put it in a box, and sent it by sea. First thing Max knew about it was he got a note from the post office to immediately come and pick up his box. But he said in self-defense he had to start smoking because it stank so badly. But he did take the quills out and get the quills and use them. This is a pair of moccasins that actually comes from the Karl Museum. You have heard that the Karl Museum is actually a collection, a very good collection. It's a small but very good collection that Patty Frank assembled and then sold to Clara May. And this is a pair of moccasins. Actually, the soles are beaded as well, and the lighter color is actually the color of the moccasin. We know a lot about these moccasins because we have the catalog card, which tells us exactly where they were acquired on the plains, and that they were ghost moccasins. And the reason they call them ghost moccasins is because of the beaded soles. They said if people went to the trouble of beating the soles, then obviously they were for dead people. Nobody would walk on those, right? Because these are glass beads. But actually, that's not true, and we know that today, that the Cheyenne and Dakota often beaded things like that. I have a friend who does Native American art, and she says there was a time in early reservation times when the Northern Plains people beaded anything that didn't walk out of the way quickly enough. And so they beaded those sorts of moccasins. And we know this because some of the beads, we have pairs of moccasins like this, where the beads are broken. And there's dirt enmeshed between the rows of the beads, so we know they were used. The reason I wanted to show you these, and as I said, these are originals. These are 19th century Plains moccasins. It's because I found this pair while I was doing research. And this is, the left one just looks a little bit different because it's stuffed. It's not professionally stuffed like the other one. But the pattern is exactly the same. There are minor, very minor differences, like the colors are slightly different. Where they use the dark blue, the original, they use the royal blue. Where the original use the royal blue, they use the light blue. And that has to do with the availability of beads. Okay. But the soles are just as beaded as everything else. And I don't know whether you can imagine how much time it takes to bead something like this. Now this particular person I will come back to, and you will see what I mean. Now this one, by the way, there's no way to tell that these moccasins are reproductions. None. Not a way in the world. There's another piece from the Karl Museum. There's another catalog card, and some of you met Hans Kunert, right? Who pointed this out to me. He gave me these particular images. On the left, you see the catalog card out of this knife sheath, and it is described, and it says the knife is notched and so forth. And we have an account from Patty Frank of acquiring this particular knife sheath, which came together with a scalp. He wanted a scalp so badly, and those two came together. He collected this in America. So we have this story, and we have the catalog card, and we know it's supposedly Dakota. The right one comes from a Christie's New York catalog auction house. Now the first thing you notice, of course, you're going to say is, wait a second, the colors are different. But that's the only difference. Look at the beadwork. Look at the band on top. There's no way to tell which of these two is the original. This particular knife sheath comes from the Zielinski collection. And we don't know much about the Zielinskis. There was a father and a son. The father worked for the Buffalo Bill Show. So he could easily have acquired this as part of from one of the Indians at the Buffalo Bill Show. That would have been perfectly reasonable. His son Erich, however, was a hobbyist who knew Patty Frank rather well. So there's no telling whether this is an original piece or this is a piece Erich Zielinski made, or whether this is actually a piece that Patty Frank sometimes did this, asked the hobbyist to make to give as a gift to Erich Zielinski. If that's the case, if this is a copy, and we're pretty sure it's a copy, if this is a copy, then this thing is also 60 years old. And that raises an issue, right? Why is the one more original than the other? And this is an issue that will become more dominant in Germany as our Indian hobbyists age. They're all older, not all, but many of them are older. What's going to happen to their outfits? What's going to happen to their things? It's going to swamp the market, and not just in Europe, everywhere. And this is a great concern to museums, Because there's no way both of these knife sheaths, beaded with the same kind of beads, exactly the same colors, beaded with the same, both of them beaded with sinew. There's absolutely no way to tell which one is the copy and which is not. So this is how authentic things have to be in the hobbies. And then we have, of course, the all-around hobbyists. And the all-around hobbyists are, for me, the most interesting. This is the guy who made the reproduction of the moccasins, actually. The gentleman to the left, his name is Fisher. And that's his family. There are 3 generations living under one roof and being part of the hobby. And if you look at, this happens to be his living room. So if you look at this, you go like, well, wait a second. Well, that's what it looks like everywhere. I always suffer from sensory overload when I'm in that house. I just can't. I wanted to take a picture of that moccasin. I only had the soles, and I wanted to decide. And he said, well, which moccasins are they? I said, well, how many pairs do you have? Well, a dozen. I was like, okay, they're green and red. Okay, I think I know which one to mean. So I was lucky he found the right ones. This is his wife, and she doesn't have one dress, she has 4 or 5. That room upstairs is so chock full of things that I just always go out of there with a headache. I just can't take it in. Okay? Those tiki bags that they're holding up are exquisite. Again, sewn with sinew, hand-tanned leather. There's no way you could tell that these are reproductions of something. They don't have one cradle board for a baby, which their daughter grew up in. They have 3 different ones, all fully beaded. She never was allowed to ride her rocking horse because it didn't have the traditional accoutrements, and only when they were beaded was she allowed to ride it, but then she said she was a little too big for it. The doll has a traditional Indian dress on it, fully beaded. I mean, this is an extreme. This is not true for all of the hobbyists, but many of them have an incredible number of objects that are just mind-blowing, beautiful. Then we have the specialists among the hobbyists, those who have actually acquired special skills. I met an arrow maker and a bow maker. I know somebody who makes these Mississippian pipes. When a friend of mine who's a curator of the sous vide collection, Maximilian sous vide, has a question about something related to pipes, she calls him because he knows everything there is to know about pipes. Another hobbyist she knows everything there is to know about crow beadwork. That's what he has done for 50 years, studied crow beadwork. So there are specialists among the Indian hobbyists. This particular guy makes flutes that some of the Native American flute players actually play. And this is his Gartenlaube, where he has all his playings. I mean, it's incredible. This is one of the trading posts. And as you see, there's a whole glass container with moccasins, different kinds of moccasins that people trade. This one is closed meanwhile, but they are available. You can buy anything you need for the hobby there. Okay, I mentioned cologne. And just to bring this home to you, I just wanted to have 2 pictures to bring to show you. This is a hobbyist club close to Cologne that actually imitates a particular time, a 20-year period during the Middle Ages of the Japanese court. That's all they do, those 20 years. And all the members have historic names. And then here you have a Hun group that also is so close to Cologne. There are about 4 or 5 Hun groups in Cologne. And I know a hobbyist who has just become a mountain man, who had to do this because his wife got tired of him being a Hun because he behaved like a Hun. And she said he would either quit or he would be unmarried. So he quit and now has become a mountain man. But I was assured by the Indian hobbyists that he's too persnickety, like many Germans are, to stay a mountain man. He's going to become an Indian hobbyist. When I look at these pictures, I always remember a friend of mine who was an archivist in Cologne. When her daughters were small, she was taking them, you know how Germans walk in the woods on Sunday afternoon? Well, she did with her two daughters, about 6 and 4. And all of a sudden there's this clanking and noise. I look around, and here is a Roman legion marching on. And the kids were so scared, they just screamed. And she's a medievalist, so she wasn't too worried by it. But she said it was an experience that she's not going to forget very quickly. Why do people do this? Well, there are different kinds of speculations why. And don't believe that my book is poking fun at people. It's not. They have an incredible knowledge, as I said. Some of it is environmentalism. You know, that has been going on in Germany for a long time. The need to be environmentally conscious. One woman said to me, well, this is my opportunity to sit down with my children on a sheepskin. Where else can I do that, right? And connect as a family. She has a very stressful job as a social worker, and so does her husband. And she finds that spending this time with their children in an environment that's totally divorced from a normal environment really helps her sort of recharge her batteries. Nobody in the office knows that she's a hobbyist. Most hobbyists don't make this public, and in many cases, people have no idea. They often learn about it when the hobbyists have an open day, or they have a fundraiser or something like that. But as a rule, people don't speak about it, and they don't say, well, I'm an Indian hobbyist, or I'm a cowboy hobbyist, or I'm a Confederate soldier. Well, that's there. Then some people, as I said before, find that this is sort of your reliving of your Karl May phase. And those who are less kind say, well, actually, people never got out of their Karl May phase. But I'm not sure that that is the explanation either. Because all of a sudden, we see this drop in the popularity of Indian hobbyist clubs. And I think it has a lot to do with World War II. Some of you who have knowledge about Germany after World War II know that there was a complete dismissal of ceremonialism. There was, when I graduated from high school, and this is the end of the 70s, when I graduated from high school, there was no ceremony to mark that. The only ceremonies in a child's life, for example, were confirmation or communion. There are no marking of the stages of life. And of course, when you consider what had just happened, that makes sense, right? That people feel that we have to swing to the other side. No more marching, no more singing, no more ceremonialism. I don't know whether many of you heard this, but about 20 years ago, they had to hire somebody to teach the national soccer players to sing the national anthem, because nobody knew what the words were. This is symptomatic, I think, of what happened in Germany. This total getting rid of ceremonialism. But we need ceremonies to define who we are. And we need ceremonies to define stages in our life. When you're a hobbyist, that becomes different. Because all of a sudden, you have charge of your life that you may not have in real life. You can determine, okay, my son or my daughter is actually getting to the state of puberty. We should have a puberty ceremony. Or we should have just a blessing, just to make us all feel better. You're in charge, and it's not even that you're dependent on other people defining what your ceremonies are. You can define your own ceremonies. It's very seductive when you think about it. It's a very seductive thing. However, today we have a generation that doesn't function like that anymore. They are into electronics. They are into communicating with the world. So they have an incredible difficulty recruiting successors. Yeah, if you are a family like this one, you have 3 generations there, that's a different story. But even those children eventually say, enough. There's peer pressure. Oh, you go to this weird thing on the weekend? That's really strange. And you know how children are. This is very difficult for them to process being different from others. I think it's coming to an end in the sense that that generation, it's not coming to an end, it won't disappear in our lifetime. But given another 50 years, and it may, depending on what happens, right? Because I think in many ways the golden years of the hobbyism in Germany are over. They're over. And they feel that themselves. The people who are coming in, they have to make concessions. Just imagine this. You can no longer demand that they read. We can no longer demand that they come on Saturday and work on the club grounds for 3 hours. We can no longer demand that they know something about Native people when we bring them into the club. Yeah, they still have to serve a 6-month probationary period, but we don't have an exam anymore. I mean, people feel very strongly on both sides of Germany, that the new generation is not going to live up to the exacting standards. And I know that's a feeling we all have, right? I scared myself the other day by thinking, when I was a child, then I know I'm not going there. I always said I would never go there, right? But we all think that the generation after us is lesser than we are, or different, right, at least. And the situation was ripe for this exertion of hobbyism from the 60s to the 90s. And now things have changed. You have more ceremonialism within Germany. Again, you have a generation that's just not interested in doing something like that. It's not high tech. And we can figure out how to be Indian hobbyists on games, and there may be a chance. But unless we do that, there isn't, I think. In many ways, it's a pity because it's a hobby that brings out good things in people. Excuse me. There's a second side to the hobby that the Indian hobbyists themselves don't like very much, and that's the powwow scene. And that's very much in Germany too. We have big powwows. This is the bringing in of the colors. I've never seen so many eagle feathers in my life. To be honest, these are traditional dancers. You will see the same everywhere, except that Germans still insist on not wearing any shorts underneath their loincloths. They think it's part of being natural. And American Indians actually get embarrassed by that when they come to Germany. Here we have a fancy dancer, just as you see at any powwow here. A jingle dress dancers. They don't dance as well as say, fancy dancer, not fancy, a grass dancer. And here we have the naked issue, a traditional dancer, which is very common. These then, as I said earlier, stand around looking pretty. They show how Indians really looked. No? They don't consider the people who celebrate the powwow, and all of them are young. Most of them are young, the majority of them are young. And they don't consider them to be hobbyists in that sense. They're a different kind of hobbyists. These are American Indians in Germany. The guy to the left is from Oklahoma. The guy from the right is from Oklahoma too. They have been in Germany for dozens of years. They are professional Indian. By the way, the Hobbyists are very proud to point out that they didn't know what their traditional outfit was until they showed it. Because they're not very modest, as you know. And German hobbyists also come to America and offer American Indians to show them how their forefathers really lived. This is a drum group, and this is one of the problems. People adopt things the way they want, and they, like the Kid Fox Society with a woman in the middle, they just wanted somebody in a pretty dress. And she has nothing to do there, traditionally. This woman has nothing to do in the drum group, and certainly not without her arms covered. As you know, this is also true for some of the pueblos. When you go to dances, you are supposed to wear a top that is not sleeveless, and that certainly applies to the drum, but in this particular case, the woman is paying more attention to it. She has a see-through skirt on and a tank top. And you see the normal traders and stuff like that going on. And that's what I have. I would like to ask you what kinds of questions you have.
Thank you.
About the replicas that are hard to distinguish, so carbon dating or something like that, in the modern technology was nothing that was precise.
I still have my microphone.
So
She was asking if carbon dating would perhaps help in seeing that there are copies. Carbon dating, the span is too wide to be helpful there. No, people, when something is offered to a museum today, people ask, look at the piece, is it hand, not hand, figure. Tanned, thanks. So tanned with deer brain, which is the traditional way to do it, or do you have the right kinds of beads? Do you have a provenance? Was this piece found? And museums are I've talked to several museum curators about this. They're very worried about this, and they don't hardly buy anything. But on the other hand, I also talked to the gentleman who makes those Mississippian pipes, and he says he has been approached by American traders about selling these pieces, which means they will go into the United States and be sold as Mississippian. And there's no way you can tell, right? So it's a catch-22. I mean, ultimately, I don't think you can tell. You will look at a piece and you go like, yeah, is the pattern right? Is it so in the sinew? All these kinds of things, but ultimately you can never be sure. You just can never be sure. Yeah.
Where do all these eagle feathers come from?
German eagles. We have eagles in the Alps.
Okay, so they're not protected?
Now they are.
They are.
Now they have to have, in the United States, you of course have to have a certificate for eagle feathers, and now in Germany you do too. But that has only been going on since the 80s. Before that, eagles were, you could shoot an eagle.
What is the average age of the hobbyists, and are the new young people joining these groups, or would they die out at some point?
I don't think they will die out, but the average age, I've heard of hobbyist clubs that are so overaged that they can't put up their teepees anymore. So they camp with another group that puts up their teepees. That's unusual. But they are about 60, 65, 70. When you think of World War II, that's about the right age group, right? And yeah, there are young people who join, but they're not enough to replace those who are dying off.
Have you found this phenomenon with other nationalities?
Yeah, and I should have mentioned that. Thank you. There are hobbyists in all Europe. In fact, there's an interesting little film clip. some of you may be familiar with the name Beatrice Madison. She was a Lakota anthropologist, and she encountered some Russian hobbyists while she was in Russia, and then made a film about it. It's about 10 minutes, and then the second part of the film shows how she shows the film about the Russian hobbyists on Standing Rock, her reservation. It's quite interesting. People are like, what? It's really interesting, the reaction. No, they're all over Europe. Not so organized. Germans are organized, and not in numbers like that, but they are everywhere. In fact, some of you may be familiar with the Hopi snake dance, or have heard about it. They use live rattlesnakes every other year traditionally. Well, I think it was 61, the French club from Paris came, and they put on a live snake dance with live snakes. So it's not just Germans, okay? It's others too, but not to the extent the Germans do it. They often say, the Swiss are pretty good. The French are okay, but the Polish, Yeah. So I learned when I was interviewing them, I often said, This was sort of my standard response to get them to talk, because sometimes they're like, no, it's wrong. But anyway, that was an interesting experience. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do these groups regularly come in the summer to the northern plains to do research? And if they do, how are they received by the tribes in your part of the country?
They're very disappointed by American Indians. They actually don't live in teepees, and they don't want to be helped. That's the worst part. We have this mission thing, very strongly. Most of us do. And actually, the first time I come home from being approached about that powwow, right? And that winter that fall I taught philosophical thought, Native American philosophical thought. And one of the students is a sort of latecomer in a very traditional family. His brother's a medicine man. And he, one day after class, says to me, Birgit, I have a question for you. There were these Germans who came this summer. And I think, oh God. The Germans who came this summer. And they told my brother he was speaking the wrong Lakota. And I said, that makes sort of sense when you think about it, because they learned the Lakota of the 19th century, right? And so modern Lakota sounds different from 19th century Lakota, just as modern English sounds different from 19th century English, right? So it's made a sort of weird sense that it was the wrong Lakota. I'm thinking like, oh God. But this happens a lot. Okay? They come to the plains, not so much anymore. Then 3 years ago, my former secretary of Lakota came back from Sundance, and she said, you won't believe what happened. And since she addressed me specifically, I thought, oh, must be the hobbyists. Sure enough, she said, those hobbyists, they came to our Sundance ground, and we asked them to leave, the Sundance leader asked them to leave, and they refused. I said, I'm not surprised. They had booked a tour. It was part of the tour, and as Germans, when you pay for something, you want it, okay? And so Mary was outraged. They had to move the Sundance pole. They had to move into a different area, And then there are those who get along with Native Americans just fine, who come over and behave properly. There are people and people, like with everything else, right? Then there are those who behave properly, but many Germans have given up on that. And especially the former East Germans are very disappointed by American Indians because they had had very little exposure. They couldn't travel until reunification in '89, right? So they never had traveled to the United States. And those who did travel, who were in America, the head chief, the old chief of the Manitou Club did. And I was told he never recovered from the experience. Yeah, because the Indians he encountered were totally not what he expected them to be. Right? Yeah. But of course, Germans know what Indians have to be like. Yeah.
Is this post-war? Was there any interwar hobbyists what are the origins of this?
Well, it goes back to that Velo cycling club and the emigration thing. So pre-World War I actually. During World War II, there were soldiers, the hobbyists. You know, my father was a soldier, he was in high school.
Was it obvious?
No, my parents thought I made it all up. My parents actually, until they died 5 and 7 years ago, were not convinced that I was telling the truth. If I had pictures, I'm sure I would have been accused of writing fiction.
So then, in the 50s, there's a huge resurgence in hobbyism. What are some of those stories? Who's the grandfather of hobbyism in the 50s?
Well, not really anybody. It sort of emerges. People, from what I can tell, okay, what happens is soldiers coming back to a devastated Germany in many cases. If you go to the northwestern part where I'm from, southern part a little less, but think Cologne, right? That area. They come back to a radically changed environment. And all of a sudden, they encounter their friends that they knew before the war and that had been hobbyists. What is closer than to restart their group, right? To create some new camaraderie, to replace what you have lost. I mean, there wasn't much to do. Germany is devastated, right? And those who are younger, who joined them then, sort of did it for the same reason. There wasn't anything to do. But in fact, I have one account of a guy from the Munich group who said that after that was one way of finding their people, to go to the Fasching or the carnivals and see who was there. And when you saw them, then you finally had a connection. Where are you meeting? Are you seeing the others? Can we get together? You know, it was a lifesaver for many people. Damaged by the war, damaged by being prisoners of war. I think it was a therapeutic event for many of them too, now that I come to think of it. Yeah.
And what seems to me that part of what you're saying also is that it allowed the integration of ceremony.
It did.
In addition to finding old friends, then because the devastated Germany didn't allow that kind of ceremony.
Exactly, and I think it all happened, and thank you for pointing this out and reinforcing this. I think there are so many complex issues involved here. It's not one or the other. There are many complex issues that come into this. And that's what made the book writing fun, actually. Yeah.
I'm wondering, you said that some of the clubs go back hundreds of years.
Not hundreds, 800.
Excuse me?
100.
Oh, well, not Indian clubs.
Yeah.
Before that, there were other clubs having nothing to do with the American Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, prior to American Indian clubs recreating the American Civil War, what were the clubs that the Germans have indulged in over those hundreds of years?
We still have them. Kleingärtner. Does somebody know what that is in English?
Victory Gardens, something like that.
Yeah, Victory Garden sort of thing. Then there are shooting,
Soccer, hiking,
die Burschenschaften, the university.
Fraternity.
Yeah, there are lots of different. There are church groups, different church organizations. There are lots of old groups in Germany that have lots of history, which I thought was fascinating. I didn't realize how long ago this actually started. We are a clubbing people. I never really believed it. I've never been in a club, so it came as a surprise to me. My parents weren't clubby, obviously, and I don't think my brother or my sister belonged to a club. But in general, you go gymnastics club, big thing. Turnvater Jan, right? Big movement in the 19th century towards fitness and health and gymnastics and doing sports. There were cycling clubs. I mean, you name it. There were all kinds of different things. Yeah, that too.
Repeat
Uh,
that,
Oh, sorry.
Sorry?
repeat that, please.
Do they ever get involved in food and feast days and stuff like that? Yes, they do. There is a history of the council that Max Olive wrote. It's sort of a journalistic account of the council, which has existed now since '51. And the council, 10 years ago, had a buffalo hunt. They served buffalo meat. And had a buffalo, the details are vague. Nobody really wants to talk about it. And I'm kind of glad about it because what it's supposed to be what it was supposed to have been was the Mandan buffalo calling ceremony. And parts of the ceremony, I kind of laughed at the details are a little vague. I didn't push very much either. But obviously, they got buffalo. And the women got to skin the buffalo, divide the meat, and then, as Max said, we ate for 10 days. And that makes sense when you think about it. It's a big animal, a buffalo. And the buffalo cost $12,000. This was somebody's donation for a special day. And Max sort of makes fun of it. He says, well, not fun of it, he makes light of it because he doesn't want to get into the ceremonialism. He says, when we were dancing and imitating the buffalo hunt, which is part of the ceremony, somebody shot the donor with an arrow. And he had an arrow sticking. Yeah. And so he had to go to the hospital to have I can just imagine the emergency room having to extract from his thigh. But the guy who shot the arrow was a winemaker. So now there's a wine that carries that momentous event on the label. Buffalo hunt.
As a footnote to that story, 10 years ago I was in Geneva, and we were driving in the mountains just above Geneva, and late afternoon, and here's this herd of buffalo. Why are these buffalo in Geneva? About the same time, there was a story in the Spanish newspaper that pointed out the obvious fact that when Buffalo Bill and the other Wild West shows came to Europe with all their livestock, it was a whole lot cheaper just to leave them in Europe than to haul them back. And the major part of the story was that American buffalo ranchers were going to Switzerland to get the semen from that old strain of buffalo because it had become too inbred here in the States. So there are American bison in Europe.
Yeah, they are. And I've seen them too. It's amazing. Then there are some who go into this whole cooking thing, right? The guy where the 3 generations are, right? The one that made the moccasins. He puts on a 16-course. He often is hired to sort of talk about Indians and to school children and so forth. And so he puts on the 16-course meal of American Indian food. I don't think it's very authentic, and some of it is not Indian. I haven't said that, because as I said, as an interviewer, you're sort of limited in what you can actually do, right? You're supposed to listen, not to actually.
A couple of comments.
Sure.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do remember that probably in the 1980s there was a Spiegel article.
Mm-hmm.
The Hobbyists Club in Berlin invited Peter Zahr, the then president of the Navajo Nation.
Mm-hmm.
They were all there in regalia, as Birgit was showing, and then Peter Zahr shows up, cowboy boots, jeans, and jacket. And they were really upset about that.
Yeah,
It's the story, right?
yeah, Louis Owens, the famous Choctaw writer, some of you may be familiar with, had the same experience in France. There was a hobbyist group that came to his interview, and the interviewer didn't ask him another question because he's always dressed like a cowboy. And the Indians, the hobbyists looked like real Indians. So the interviewer talked to the Indians, not to Louis Owens, who obviously was a cowboy. Okay.
And the second comment that I have is, if some of you were here when Kirk Ellis introduced the initial movie,
Yes.
Kirk Ellis says that every American diplomat who is assigned to a German language country has to read excerpts, still today, of Karl May, so the diplomats get an understanding why the Germans have that quirky idea of how an Indian or a Native American has to, or looks like. So they make them read excerpts of Karl May, apparently what Kirk Ellis says still today.
That's interesting. I have to ask my sister too. My sister runs the international office of Humboldt University in Berlin. I have to ask her if she sees an American ambassador the next time. Ask him if he actually read Karl May. She will do it too.
Just a comment that we have reenactments.
He can do that too. Not so much Indian,
No, more
for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Right?
But Civil War and
Yeah.
Society for Creative.
Anachronisms. It's here too. It's just much more organized and much more serious in Germany.
Anal.
Anal, I don't know about anal, but it's, yeah, well, yeah, okay, anal.
I mean, I think part of it is people like to dress up in costumes.
Oh, yeah, they do.
Be something else.
And sometimes hobbies started as people who participated in Mardi Gras in Germany. But Mardi Gras is, you don't say that to a hobbyist, that's a bad thing. Bad thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, there was one question here.
No, go ahead, I just,
Go ahead.
thank you.
Oh, I belong to or I've been studying Ernest Thomason Seton for a long time, who had the Woodcroft Indians,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a World Woodcraft camp now that happens in the Czech Republic and also in England that are very, very similar. The way that they are emulating the 19th century Indians. And I asked one time, why did they choose to emulate Indians? Why were they not using the Czech ancient peoples? And they said, because we don't know about them. And the Indians are still there, and they are still doing what they were doing then. And there was a film made, I don't know if you've ever seen that, If Only I Were an Indian, Canadian film made.
Our hobbyists frown on Seton and woodcraft and so forth. They don't want anything to do with it. But if you go to, I just read about the hobbyist movement in Finland. If you go to Finland, the movement is totally different. And that grew actually out of the Boy Scouts of America. And they call themselves the warriors, the spirit warriors of the North today, the Indian hobbyists. It's different in different countries, but the same tenets basically apply.
Yeah, you were talking about powwows and social dances and so on. You did bring up the snake dance, which I guess is religious dance.
Oh yeah, very much
Is
so.
there any more evidence of religious dances, such as buffalo dance, deer dance? Has there been any attempt to really study Native American religion and incorporate it into these hobbyist clubs?
Oh, yeah.
Is there a Native American church, peyote ceremonies?
No, that's not traditional, according to the hobbyists. Of course it is, but it's not according to the hobbyists.
Oh, it's illegal in Germany, okay.
Besides peyote is illegal. But it's